Hi, my name is Aarathi and I'm a journalist at MediaNama. Today, I have Sachin Dhawan from the Center for Communication Governance here with us to talk about one aspect of competition that's often less talked about in media and policy circles, and that's in the case of free speech. Outside of e-commerce and digital markets, we're seeing the concentration of a lot of speech on a very few large platforms on the internet. Does this actually matter? Does it have consequences? And does it have anything to do with the huge content moderation problem that seems to be on the tip of every regulator's tongue currently? These are some of the questions that I have for Sachin, and that's what we'll be discussing today. So great to have you here, Sachin. Thank you so much for doing this with us. The first
Thank you,
question,
Aarti.
thank you so much. The first question I had was essentially what I just asked, like, why is, first of all, content moderation on the tip of every regulator's tongue currently? Is this a competition issue? And is there something unique about this moment in time that might explain why this explosion of information is creating these competition issues in the first place?
Yeah, no, thanks, Aarti. I guess, the first thing we need to understand is, what are the complaints actually regarding content moderation about, right? So when people ask or complain about poor content moderation, or low quality content moderation, what do they mean? I think the misconception is that poor content moderation means virtually no content moderation. That is to say that platforms don't want to moderate content or remove content, and that their ideal is some kind of a free for all. This is incorrect. I think poor content moderation means moderation that is guided or determined by commercial incentives, the profit motive. And this is not the same as no content moderation. So uh, I think it's important to recognize, firstly, that it's in platforms' commercial self-interest to remove certain pieces of content and promote other pieces of content. They have, for example, pressure from advertisers who don't want their ads appearing next to, say, white supremacist content. As Talton Gillespie says, content moderation is the service or the product that platforms offer. But the moderation is poor because it doesn't prioritize the well-being and interests of users. I think the first thing to recognize is that platforms were never designed to operate at the scale of billions of users. They didn't start out as monopolies. Consequently, actually, what happened is that the content moderation rules, the systems, they weren't designed so much, they weren't designed to deal with so much content. So, to deal with the problem of scale that has since emerged, platforms have done two things. They've hired more content moderators and they've deployed more AI. Both approaches, unfortunately, have failed. Um, you have poorly paid and overworked content moderators who are completely cut off from the communities of users that they are moderating. They cannot and they can't be expected to get tough calls right, often in a matter of seconds. Uh, Unfortunately, AI doesn't work properly either, because AI is, if anything, worse at taking context into account, right? And moreover, we know so little about how AI works. It's essentially a black box. So we don't really know about the prevalence of things like false positives. We know about AI bias, but we know it's pervasive, but we don't know as much about it as we ought to. Basically, what you need is people from that community to do the moderation for the moderation to work well. But that's not how moderation works in centralized closed platforms. It's top down, it's impersonal. Unfortunately, the game is rigged, right, in favor of the rich and powerful. This is where, again, the commercial interests and incentives of the platforms comes in. There are different rules which apply to prominent public figures as compared to, say, ordinary users. And platforms are also much more likely to succumb to pressure from powerful governments in the West than from governments in African and Asian countries. And this, of course, perpetuates inconsistencies, double standards, and it leads to the problems that we're so familiar with today. And finally, platforms are smart. They know that users have no choice. Users have nowhere else to go. So even if platforms are, say, doing a bad job of moderating content, it's not going to affect their bottom line. The main monopoly platforms have, over the years, merged with and acquired so many nascent competitors and would-be rivals that they have ensured their market dominance, right? Even when users explicitly tell platforms what they want, after platforms explicitly ask for their opinion, they're ignored, right? So yeah, if you're operating in a monopolistic market, what's going to happen is that platforms set the terms, right? And if they set the terms are going to be stacked in their favor and stacked against us.
Right. Thank you so much for that, Sachin. And just to piggyback off of what you said, and perhaps to be the devil's advocate as well, it's easy to see the big platform also as the bad guy in this equation. My question is, you mentioned community-led moderation, for example. Is that even a viable alternative? Because you've also mentioned that we're looking at a massive scale. Could you reasonably say that a community-led group of moderators would be able to reasonably moderate all of that? Would we have the time, the inclination, the incentive to even do it?
Yeah, I think we have to decide, what we want to prioritize, right? Definitely, if we want to be on the big platforms, if we want to take advantage of the services, the value that they do have to offer, I think we'll have to accept the costs that I just talked about. We can't have our cake and eat it too.
I know that makes sense. The interesting flip or alternative to that is I think Mozilla recently announced its sort of beta testing for its social media platform. And it mentioned that we want to get rid of the toxicity and the muck that, is found on so many of these platforms currently. And the first thing people spoke about was free speech. So I think the having your cake and eating it too argument and dilemma is everywhere. But that's exactly what my next question was about as well, which is it's something that the Indian government has raised repeatedly over the last few months as we're looking at consultations for the Digital India Act, which is set to replace the Information and Technology Act. The IT minister has repeatedly said that, safe harbor is the reason for a lot of the malpractice and bad content that you see online. Platforms are lackadaisical. It's just a bad scenario all around. And perhaps we should consider getting rid of safe harbor or having like a limited or graded approach to it. And I can understand that from the perspective of what you just spoke about, which is that platforms, perhaps are not very incentivized to do a great job. But I'm also interested if removing safe harbor again links back to the same competition concerns. Does it actually end up helping those platforms because they have the resources to do what they're doing?
Yeah, for sure. I think the loss of safe harbor protection will stifle competition. I think that's pretty clear. I think smaller platforms won't be able to cope with the need for increased investment in filtering tools. They won't be able to cope with the increase in litigation expenses, as a result of which they'll exit the market. And once they exit, the big platform dominance, which is already there, will become more pronounced. And the big platforms will leverage this dominance to enter and dominate new markets. So if I just take it step by step, in terms of the impact of loss of safe harbor on competition, if I can start by looking at, say, filtering tools, right? The big platforms already spend billions of dollars on proactive monitoring and automated filtering. They're slated to spend even more on these tools in the years to come. If safe harbor is removed, then these big platforms will already have the tools in place on day one to deal with the extra liability. But the smaller platforms, as I was indicating earlier, who are seeking to increase competition in the marketplace, will struggle severely. They simply don't have the money to invest in heavy duty automated tools. Then if you look at litigation, if there's no safe harbor, platforms, as I said just now, will be liable for the third party content that they host. Now, moderators are inevitably going to make wrong calls, right? AI tools are not perfect. And this will lead to platforms being sued by their users. The big platforms will be able to afford the increase in legal expenses, but small platforms will go bankrupt as a result of such mounting legal expenses. In fact, a US court once colorfully referred to this phenomenon as death by 10,000 duck bites. Right? You've got so many cases, and as a small platform, you just can't handle it and you go under. And then finally, in terms of big platforms extending their reach to new markets, if you lose safe harbor, if there's an exit of smaller platforms from the market, uh, what's going to happen? The bottleneck power of big platforms is going to go up, right? This is bad not just for platforms in the UGC, user-generated content, and social media space, but also for startups in other markets. Because what happens is platforms that have acquired dominance in one market, and we've seen this historically, they tend to want to leverage that dominance to entrench themselves in new markets.
What we have established is that there seems to be a nexus between safe harbor, free speech, and competition issues. And that's a very tenuous nexus. I just mentioned three different stakeholders while trying to describe it. And the question for me then comes down to then, like, if you had a sort of regulator in India that was trying to adjudicate on that complex intersection, who would it be?
So I think first, I think we need to identify the problem, right? And the problem is that when there are only a handful of platforms, a few channels of communication, free speech suffers. Because you may have the right to speak in theory, but in practice, you will only get to exercise this right and be heard by your listeners if these gatekeeper platforms give you permission to speak. So the solution is increase pluralism, increase diversity by increasing the options for users, essentially by increasing user choice. How do we get there? How do we reach that solution point? Uh, I think first we need to think about changing the law, and specifically I'm thinking of the Digital India Act. I think the Digital India Act can go a long way towards promoting competition in speech. I think the way to do this is by incorporating provisions in the Digital India Act concerning data portability and interoperability. The Digital Services Act has already done so. It has incorporated provisions regarding interoperability. Even in the US, there's draft legislation. The Access Act is what is known as, which has provisions relating to interoperability. So I think the DIA can also do so. Interoperability will help to deal with the problem of walled gardens that currently keeps users stranded in closed platforms. So again, right, what is the problem? I have to join these walled gardens if I want to participate in modern society. And because of network effects, everyone I want to convey my speech to is in these walled garden platforms. I can't leave because then I won't be able to speak to my listeners or my followers. In other words, the switching costs are high. And more than that, if I am being censored or my speech is being cut off, I'm basically cut off from participating in most of the major speech discussions that take place in society. That means I'll be afraid to speak out, lest I be silenced, right? So, what is the irony here? That essentially, in effect, there's a chilling effect on my speech. And so, what has to be done is punch holes. We have to punch holes in the wall gardens. That lets users go out and come in, and that's what interoperability does, right? It allows users on one platform to communicate with users on another platform. So let's say I'm not on Twitter. I don't want to be subject to the rule of King Musk, but I care about the people on Twitter. I want to be able to reach them, to communicate with them. Interoperability mandates prevent Musk from preventing me from speaking to Twitter users. So punching holes into walled gardens has another positive effect. This goes back to some of the initial points we were discussing, which is that it puts pressure on these walled garden platforms to do a better job, to respect their users more, because they know that tomorrow their users can leave. I think also we have to think about uh, clamping down on giant mergers, clamping down on anti-competitive agreements, clamping down on combinations, on platforms when they abuse their dominant position. And I think the way forward here is we have to do away with the consumer welfare standard in competition law. This is a standard that US courts have come up with relatively recently, which is actually in violation of US congressional intent going back over a century and even long-standing judicial precedent in the US. And in fact, US courts are slowly realizing the error of their ways. And I think so should we, right? So instead of a superficially simple but actually complex question about whether targeted conduct enhances consumer welfare or not, which is a question that is often asked, I think courts, you asked about which bodies should come in. I think the CCI courts should simply ask whether the conduct in question promotes competition or suppresses competition. At the end of the day, the goal of antitrust law or competition law has always been preservation of competition. And I think to the extent that the Competition Act, to the extent there's any doubt about this in the Competition Act, it should be amended. A renewed Competition Act in India can act on the basic insight of visionaries going back to the American and French revolutions, right? Which is what? That with great power comes great irresponsibility, right?
Thanks for that. I was thinking of the Spider-Man quote, so thanks for refreshing my memory. But you mentioned something really interesting, which is that we're at this unique stage in history where private capital can essentially have the power to eclipse government or eclipse government authority. There is a publicly funded digital space. Uh, the solution to that, does that sort of address some of the competition issues and free speech limitations that you've spoken of? Or are we simply putting too much faith? When I'm thinking about this, are we putting too much faith perhaps in the government to respect this very tricky thing, which is our free speech rights?
Sure. I think the solution to the problem of centralized platforms is decentralized platforms, right? Decentralized social media, where you don't have centralized content moderation. And that's when the voices which can spark progress and reform, the voices of iconoclasts, dissenters, and the marginalized, can finally be aired, right? So I think decentralized technology, such as federation or peer-to-peer protocols, is the answer, or is an answer, right? You were referring to Spider-Man earlier, and maybe you've also familiar with the multiverse. Something that has come up recently is the Fediverse, right? And the Fediverse powers instances, which I was referring to earlier as well, which are comparable to social media applications and services. And the good thing is, unlike centralized platforms, anyone can create and run an instance, right? Long as they follow the protocol. And so what you have here is that instead of one company dictating the rules for everyone, on decentralized social media, a wide array of instances can have their own set of rules. You can be a part of an instance, say that is very pro free speech, so you have very few restrictions on what you see. I can be a part of an instance that is, say, more friendly or child oriented, child safety oriented. We can make our choices, right? We don't have to subject ourselves to one single kind of content moderation system to rule them all. So this gives users choice and autonomy. Say you're a user on an instance and you don't like the way your instance is handling content, you can move to my instance or some other instance, right? Without losing access to the wider network. And this fluidity also empowers users to effectively participate in the management and governance of their instance. So because, let's say you're part of an instance, because the instance, the other users, the instance administrator, they know that you can easily leave. They listen to your complaints more seriously. Again,
Yeah.
unlike as I was saying earlier, whereby, users' complaints, views, perspectives are not taken into account at all. Here it matters because you can vote with your feet. So yeah, and I think I'll just end by saying that again, social media is decentralized. Again, what's the principle? Where does the competition aspect come in? It'll put pressure on centralized platforms to do a better job of moderating content and caring for the welfare of their users. Another point here is that governments could mandate, and this is something possibly that could be in the DIA, that large social media platforms interoperate with, these Fediverse type instances. And under such a regime, Twitter, for example, it could be allowed to choose what users or content appear on its servers, but it would have to allow other Fediverse instances to communicate with it. And this would allow users who wanted access to content that Twitter removes to still access it and still interact with the broader Twitter community. So that's why I think decentralized social media is the way forward. Very quickly, in terms of taxpayer-funded online parks and that sort of system, you're right. It has its own problems in terms of speech, in terms of say government-related speech. But I think it will still contribute to pluralism in social media markets, right? Which again will increase user choice and put pressure on mainstream platforms to do a better job.
Right. Thank you so much for that and a resounding defense for federalized platforms. So I'm glad to hear it and sort of understand it for once. So thanks a lot for this, Sachin. This has been super helpful. If you'd like to follow more of Sachin's work on these issues, do check out his work at the Center for Communication Governance. Sachin was also a panelist at MediaNama's recent Markets Nama conference, where he touched upon some of these issues as well as general issues with the governance of content and free speech online in India. Thanks so much again, Sachin, and look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.